Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this breakout session from Dubai to Brazil, Article 6 and International Market Cooperation. My name is Andrea Bonzanni, International Policy Director at AITA, and I'll be the moderator of this session. As you all know, COP28 ended in disappointment for carbon market advocates like us, as negotiators failed to agree on further guidance on Article 6.2 and 6.4. This session will unpack the reasons for the lack of consensus in Dubai, reflect on the consequences it had for the negotiations and the wider carbon markets, and look into the prospects for agreements at COP29 in Baku and COP30 in Brazil. I'll be joined by a panel of outstanding experts, negotiators and practitioners. I will call them to join me on stage one by one, starting from Lisa DeMarco, who's Senior Partner and CEO at Resilient LLP. She has many years of experience in Article 6 and carbon market negotiations, and she's also a member of the AITA Council, which she chaired until last year. Next, Olga Ghassanzadeh, Article 6 negotiator for Ukraine and a member of the Article 6.4 supervisory body, which she also chaired last year. Then Natalie Flores-Gonzalez. She's the former head of climate change at the Ministry of Environment in the Dominican Republic, and now serves as the vice chair of the UNFCCC SUBSTA, the scientific body on, subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice. Amongst her many engagements, she's a member of the Independent Advisory Committee of ICROA and a member of the Technical Advisory Board of the Ecosystem Restoration Standards. Last but not least, Christopher Hakes, Head of Carbon Sales at Cookstoff Company Bern, which is active in 11 African countries. Christopher recently moved to Nairobi, Kenya, and prior to joining Bern, he was with BMO Radical in Toronto. So I'm going to sit down, join my panelists on stage. And I'm going to start with the first question to Lisa. Lisa, you were in Dubai and you were very close to the negotiations. So can you please explain to our audience what happened, what were the main position and the main fault lines, and why we ended up with no outcome?
It was, as I say, disappointing to watch the unfolding of what happened in Dubai, and really somewhat of a departure from what is usually a progressive, incremental process over time. And we saw a few parties shift their approach and affiliation and like of markets quite significantly. And in particular, we saw an interesting alliance develop between the EU, who is usually not quite as progressive and aggressive on environmental integrity as the Environmental Integrity Group. And this year was the most strident and non-flexible on a number of the key issues. And they formed an alliance with the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, who are very focused on facilitating activity under Article 5, which is not a market mechanism, it's a results-based payment mechanism. And so from that perspective, a couple of the key issues that resulted in some challenges, of course there are always politics at play, and there was a backdrop of, I think, personal and other politics that came to bear, but the substantive issues were in and around authorization. Not just authorization of the parties to a transaction, a cooperative approach, but authorization of the cooperative approach itself. And there was a very fundamental disjoint on the view to whether or not there had to be an overseen independent body or UN approval or authorization of the cooperative approach itself, versus a bilateral mechanism under Article 6.2 that was regularly anticipated through Sharm el-Sheikh, through Glasgow, and through the detailed rules we got there. And then there were differences in and around authorizations of the project-based mechanisms or substance of what would become a transaction between parties or between a party and a program like CORSIA. That was on Article 6.2 at a very high level. On Article 6.4, there were two elements that were really fairly fundamental, and one was in and around removals, and the other was in and around procedures to facilitate what was going on to get the actual mechanisms implemented. And it was fairly disappointing that, particularly on Article 6.2, when we had everything except the I dotted and T crossed on things like the agreed electronic format. How do we report? How do we track through a system that already has all the forms in place? That we couldn't get agreement on the draft format. And in particular, after all the hard and significant work done on Article 6.4 by Olga and the supervisory body, that we couldn't get approval of the essential elements around removals and the methodologies that were so ardently worked on. So we'll talk about what's going forward at a later time, but some fundamental fault lines there, and I don't think they're going away soon.
Thank you, Lisa. Olga, do you have anything to add or comment on Lisa's assessment? And what do you think the prospects are this year and perhaps next year for progress and eventually an agreed text?
Thank you. I share very much Lisa's reflection of what has happened. I think I probably should preface that, I'm on the supervisory body in my personal expert capacity, and so I'm here also in my personal expert capacity. I don't see journalists in the room. I don't want it to be misreported. This is Olga Gussansson, the individual speaking. There's really a fundamental rift of views of what is the meaning of international carbon markets in the context of the Paris Agreement. EU and its member states have just made a submission to Article 6.4 supervisory body. And the process, you asked about the process. So the process we decided at the previous meeting, which we had in March, is that we will open for submission, particularly asking for submissions from parties. There'll be a compilation, and then there'll be an event at the subsidiary bodies meeting in June, and then we'll be supposedly reworking the guidances. And so the EU has made submission and welcome everybody to go into the interaction with the stakeholders, calls for inputs, and then you'll see their submission. And it's very, the reason why 6.4, they rejected, right? The text was there, right? There was a disagreement on a word, one single word. And the reason why it was rejected is explained in that submission, supposedly. But there was a, disagreement on accounting, but that's very small issue reflects that rift that, in my personal view, EU doesn't believe that international offset markets belong in the Paris Agreement. And if they belong, they should be limited to permanent engineering removals. They export the same view into Article 6.2, and that makes discussions on Article 6.2 very difficult. They have, huge range of instruments and textual points and, blah, 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 the paragraphs that only a few experts follow. But if you sum it up, that will be the worldview that we see in a larger context.
Lisa?
I couldn't help but notice there's a literary term called pathetic fallacy, and that's when the weather matches the mood. We just had thunder and lightning, say no more.
Okay, Natalie, how's the situation perceived by climate negotiators working on other topics and in countries that are still considering Article 6 as a tool to meet the NDC and pursue the climate goals? Can you provide your reflections?
I want to start with a question to the audience. Who has been to COP? Raise your hand. Okay. Who understands how the UN climate change takes the decision? Like, have you ever asked yourself why people do not reach agreement? Like, have you put yourself in that perspective of understanding how it works? So who thinks that understands how decisions are being made? Okay. Okay, so I think the most important part of the conversation is understanding how the international system works, especially multilateralism that we've been talking like for the past 3 days, at least in the sessions that I've been watching all these days in preparation for this specific session. But the point is that, and I've been saying this since the moment I was appointed as SAPSTA Vice Chair, which is the body for science and technology of the UN climate change, and everybody's like, but what technology do you do? What science do you do? What we do, I mean, I'm appointed by a government within the framework of a group of countries, which are the small island developing states, and I moderate a process with a chair that is from Holland, developed country, and the secretariat serve the countries for them to talk to each other. So that's key to understand how decisions are being made. The other thing is that the UN climate change, as any other UN convention, is funded by the governments. So governments pay a quota to be part of the convention and to have the enabling environment to talk to each other. And I think that's key to understand as well, because even though the international community, which includes all stakeholders around this, right? So agencies, NGOs, academia, and everything request to be in the process, we cannot forget that it's a party-driven process and that the parties are the one making the decisions. And the other thing is that depending on the party that you represent, like I did before, the Dominican Republic, though in Bonn, I'm going to be also representing the Dominican Republic as their advisor to perform this role. It's a consensus based, so we cannot vote. Everything needs to be agreed by everyone. And if somebody doesn't agree, then we don't have a decision. And that's exactly the good thing and the bad thing of what happened in Dubai. Of course, I have a totally different perspective because my first session as vice chair of the SAPSTA was COP28. And now I respect the UNFCCC Secretariat even more. Like, I don't know how they work, how they perform what they do for parties to talk to each other. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that we achieve huge milestones in the framework of COP28 in terms of phasing out from fossil fuels, in terms of renewable energies and everything behind that. So parties, we tend to complicate our lives in the negotiation process when we demand for funding from developed countries. And I think that's key to understand NDCs and the decision and how it connects with what we want to implement with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And in these negotiations, what we do, small countries request to big countries funding. And we are requesting an international decisions that unlock funding for different things that we do and that we put into place at the same level of our constitution, because when you ratify a multilateral convention, that has the same power of the constitution of your country. So big country says, okay, I'm gonna give you taxpayer money for you to fight climate change because it's my fault, but you need to comply with this, and that. And I think it's important to understand that, because then we are complicating ourselves every time that we are negotiating with a big country, even a tabular Excel to actually report our GHG inventories. But we need $1 million to actually report a GHG, inventory. So everything connects from there, and I think it's important to understand how the convention works and what's the role of the private sector. So what we did in the Dominican Republic when we were putting together our NDC, and I'm gonna stop because I can keep talking, when we were putting together our NDC is to involve all stakeholders, including the private sector. So the private sector tells the government what mitigation actions they can comply and what can they invest with the enabling environment that the government provides them. So you have an NDC from a very small country that has a decarbonization pathway, but we are not developed. Yet we live from tourism. We need nature. And a part of that, we don't have a strong structure for emissions reduction from the private sector. So what the UNFCCC decision does is actually bring the private sector to the table for them to do that kind of investment. And in terms of Article 6, I respect Olga a lot. I'm a fan, by the way. Well, I'm a fan of everybody over here. But I think it's important to explain to everyone that we, the parties, decided that we wanted a supervisory board for Article 6.4. And then the parties meeting in Dubai said that 12 people couldn't tell them how Article 6 was going to work. So that's the type of things that you get in a negotiation session when parties are playing geopolitical games. And it's important to understand the intrinsic of geopolitics to understand how a decision can be delayed and how it's so frustrating not having operationalization of something like that. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Natalie. So we heard about the position of parties, we heard about the broader picture, we introduced geopolitics, the intricacies of the UNFCCC. But what does this mean for the private sector? Christopher, someone like you, your company who develops projects, invest in activities on the ground, how is all this perceived? What's the impact on projects on the ground?
Thanks, Andrea. I think the first thing I will say is I will never complain about a contract in the VCM ever again, given what we've just heard. It is far simpler. So I think I would start by saying something, quoting what I heard from a gent from Macquarie yesterday, and I think he said something along the lines of, where there is clarity, there is liquidity. And clearly we don't quite have clarity yet. And like everyone in this room, I yearn for that. And instead, of course, this lack of action last year has impacted all of us. Now, of course, it would be convenient to blame Article 6 on some of the challenges we have as developers and as traders in this market, but there happen to be one or two other headwinds going on in the VCM at the moment, so it wouldn't be quite fair. Despite all these headwinds I mentioned, I will say this, representing the market, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts later too. We see experienced investors and buyers really interested in still moving towards our market. More clearly across the market, we see a flight, for all the reasons we've talked about, to the seeking of higher quality, whatever that may be, dependent how you define. But host countries and investors are willing to proceed with high quality A6 projects. Bern is proceeding with 6.2 projects with global north countries and supplier countries in Africa. And from our perspective, of course, it'd be optimal if this all happens next year, but we'll wait to hear what other people say on that subject. Of course, because every day we don't move on this stuff, the continued uncertainty has implications. And what I mean by that, from our perspective, of course, we are, as developers, you can only be so nimble when it comes to responding to markets. So without clear signals, that's a challenge for us. As with all their elements, these uncertainties around rules, the timing, claims, et cetera, just kind of pile on to make a very complicated system. I'll just close these remarks by saying that how are we seeing end buyers responding to this? My own personal experience has been that many of the calls I take, people are interested in, but if they're not a sophisticated buyer, they have kind of conflated LOAs, Corsia, all these different tags and things we're putting on as a proxy for high quality. And of course, as we can all attest to in this room, corporates don't need to be engaged in those necessarily. Point being, it's confusing. So we do our best, I do my best certainly, to reassure them and walk them through what is a very complicated process, help them understand, and also on the sidelines talking about where 6.2 and 6.4 may be leading and how this may impact them. But it's complicated. So it's difficult, particularly when you can't provide them with any clear timelines. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So based on what we heard, and we certainly didn't paint a very bright and optimistic picture. Do we really need to wait for further guidance to implement Article 6? Or can we just go ahead with countries and companies that are willing to act? Who wants to reflect on this?
I can take it. I personally believe that it is important to act and to demonstrate the value of international project-based mechanisms and how they can be done with high environmental integrity and certainty. Because by setting examples, we are already creating these frameworks. And for those that would like to regulate from their offices of never stepping on in the field, and they create this sort of spherical horses in vacuum, I call them, right? That imagination works. You need to give these examples of things that are actually working, things that are practical, and how people are trying to resolve the very, very difficult issues that actually exist. How do you insure projects? How do you ensure permanence? How do you discount for reversals? What do you do? How does the market find ways to deal with that? And the practical experience is very important.
Lisa?
Yeah, let me just touch base in terms of not a legal lecture, but a mini legal lecture. Public international law is formed in a few ways. And one way is by treaty. One way is by bilateral agreement between countries. And the third way is by pattern and practice. And in particular, where you have countries following the same pattern and practice, and they mutually or individually recognize that pattern and practice, you have evidence of public international law. In Article 6.2, we have clear consensus-based decisions. They came in the form of Glasgow, and they were iterated in Sharm el-Sheikh. The open elements are, what do the forms that you submit to report on what you've done look like? Everything else is in law. The most practical path forward is to have parties use that draft agreed electronic format, and because you all need an acronym, that's an AEF. Use the same one. Use what's in the draft, start reporting and doing it. Then you have pattern and practice and public international law. So I think in Article 6.2, nothing further is needed other than some consistent actions. In Article 6.4, it's a little bit trickier. And the geopolitics that Natalie referred to are interesting. If you contrast the geopolitics that existed at the time we got Paris, that existed at the time that we got Glasgow, we now have 3 armed global conflicts that are energy transition, impacting at a minimum, related at a maximum. And the geopolitics are going to be tricky, but that doesn't mean there isn't a bulk of inertia, of energy moving towards approval of the many aspects that have been agreed by a number of parties, in fact, the majority of parties. So we'll see how that works.
Natalie, I see you nodding and smiling, so do you want to add
Yeah,
something?
I told you, I'm in happy land with this panel over here. And Lisa and I were together in San Francisco like 2 weeks ago, and it was exactly the same. So we were like back and forth, back and forth. But what I want to say is that we've been negotiating under the UN climate change for 30 years. I've been in the process for 14 years. My first COP was COP16 in Mexico, and I was at the stand of the Dominican Republic, so not negotiating. But the point is that we are not reducing emissions. And then we have Article 6.2 over there waiting to be unlocked and waiting to be implemented. We have bilateral agreements with a lot of countries. You have Switzerland, Japan, Sweden, Singapore leading the way and working with, small developing countries, including mine. I had the honor of leading 2 bilateral agreements, one with the Swedish Energy Agency and another one with the Ministry of Trade and Investment of Singapore. And it's there. And even when the buyer and the seller are enabling the environment of how this agreement is going to be implemented, you can be part of the process of implementing that and being part of developing a high integrity project. But what is a high integrity? From the country perspective, it's just transparency, correct? Because carbon is complicated, countries have to report a lot, corporates have to report. How do you connect your corporate report with the greenhouse gas inventory of the country, which for me, since I was in charge of that, it's really important, science-based approaches and all of this. So it's there, and we need to reduce emissions. So I always talk about the Montreal Protocol, that is actually my favorite treaty as a diplomat, because it works. Like, we managed to close the ozone layer, like for real, with a treaty. And then why we don't reduce emissions from climate change? So I think we have to put ourselves in perspective, and if we want the BCM to be taken seriously, then the BCM needs to deliver reducing emissions and helping the countries to reduce emissions, and that's the thing.
Thanks. Christopher, question for you, is the risk, from your perspective, is the risk of developing projects while the Article 6 rule book is still open excessive, or is it something that can be done?
No, I think it can be done. I mean, I think to Lisa's point, 6.2, we are rolling along. I mean, it's exciting. As developers, as market participants, it's incredibly intoxicating getting involved. And to your point around, we look at examples like when there's a market signal, when there's a clear pathway, and Singapore's a relatively limited size, quite honestly. What is it, 5% of total whatever covered emissions. So I think we're going to see a lot of participants trying to charge in there and trying to get some action happening on that. That is just indicative of all the energy that we're feeling in the developer sector that can react in fairly short order. My understanding, so moving on to 6.4 maybe for a moment, which is one I confess I don't understand to the same level, so I'm very pleased to be sharing this stage with my esteemed colleagues. But I think under 6.4 we need to better understand our role as developers under national parties, nationally determined contributions. In our world, in the clean cooking world, I understand the Clean Cooking Alliance is developing a new methodology. So, if 6.4 goes ahead, if it works, and if we believe it's a high integrity, then we do anticipate lots of interest from investors and from buyers. But if the supervisory body, doesn't, I'm not sure the timeline, again, we're going to talk to that, isn't able to act, before COP, and then another 6 months are spent finalizing methodologies, then we start developing carbon assets, then we look at investment, distribution, of stoves, and then a year of monitoring activities. All of a sudden, our timelines are protracted. We're looking at 26, 27, and that's awfully close to 2030.
Thanks. Lisa?
Yeah, I just want to tweak the narrative here around if carbon markets work. We had recent reports from Carbon Market Watch and Climate Insights that indicated over the last 5 years, corporates reducing their emissions, Scope 3 emissions, through markets, reduced them 48%. 48% since 2019. That's a 5-year halving of emissions. Just imagine if we really amp up markets and get more clarity, more certainty, more predictability into them, what we can do in the next 5 years.
Okay, I feel like we started with a very bleak mood, then we started to talk about projects and implementation, and we see that it's not all that bad. There is action on the ground and there is hope. I'd like to open up to questions from the floor. There should be 2 roving mics. So I see Jan Willem here and the gentleman here at the front.
Yeah, good afternoon after lunch. I have a question for Natalie. What relationship do you see or connection point with the other topic for Baku, which will be the NCQG discussions?
And can you please introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, well, you did. Jan Willem van der Ven, EBRD.
She's gonna, and then, yeah, we complement each other. Go ahead.
Okay, I can start. I mean, Natalie also knows, the new collective quantified goal on finance will be the most important topic to be decided in Baku. And whether or not carbon finance is to be counted as climate finance is indeed one of the issues up for negotiation in Baku. And it's up to parties, Natalie, very well. I think, thank you very much for highlighting. It's up to the parties. And there are over 190 parties to the Paris Agreement. And it's their time to have their say.
And small countries demand finance, so that's the fight. The fight is always like, I need, you give me, I need, you give me. And as I was saying before, like without a global decision on finance deployment, then countries cannot perform. But the corporate world moves, I don't know how many times, what a country, like what the country can pledge at the UN. Because the country is pledging taxpayer money, as I'm saying, like the government, where is the money from the government coming from? So small countries are asking developed countries for finance that is going to be given to the Green Climate Fund, to the Global Environmental Facility and other multilateral agencies to actually give it to other UN agencies to implement in the countries. So it's like a never-ending game while the private sector is actually unlocking real finance like the BCM was doing and is doing and can do, you know what I mean? So what I want to say is, I mean, I want to add that some countries, in Latin America specifically, because that's my region and I'm very proud to be from there and what they are doing, it's actually putting in their schemes standards that were created for the BCM, and they are putting laws into place, they are putting decrees and national resolutions to actually have those standards in what they want to do for taxing carbon in general. You have the example of Chile, you have the example of Panama that has 3 memorandum of understanding with 3 different standards that are standards of the BCM, and then you have subnational governments like Querétaro in Mexico, then you have subnational governments in Argentina that are actually putting all these things into place, and that's why I see the strength of what the BCM has created, and the finance that we need and the decisions, at the end, that decision is just for that country game and UN agencies implementation game. So if you really want to achieve climate action through this finance approach, the private sector needs to come to play and demand the enabling environment from the government, and tell them, like, stop, putting together this little development project that at some point are good, but bring us to the table and let's do this together, as the countries that I'm mentioning before are doing with what the BCM has created, and some of those standards are here, and I mean, Latin America is far behind of other countries, but at the same time, it's leading the way, taking, this decision at that level when it comes to the carbon market and unlocking that finance. And this is personal. This is not the UN SABSTA Vice Chair. This is Natalie Flores. I think Baku is going to perform as a bridge COP. And we have had many bridge COPs that, it's like a bridge to another big one. And I wish the best to the presidency. I'm going to be chair in that capacity, but I think it's going to be a bridge COP. And that's why the three presidency came with the Troika, that it's UAE, Azerbaijan, and Brazil working together towards global decisions at COP30, and that's the name of this panel. So the Article 6 negotiators want a decision in Baku, but I think we're gonna be talking a lot in Bonn, and after Bonn, you will read in my LinkedIn what I think and what happened.
Thanks. Well, second question here at the front, and then there's a third one at the back.
Thank you. Frédéric Simon from Carbon Pulse. I have a question about the EU's carbon removal certification framework. I'd like to have the panel's views about what this could mean for Article 6. Do you think there is a potential that this becomes de facto some kind of global standard? Do you think this is possible, and do you think this is desirable? Thank you.
Very good question. Perhaps Lisa, Olga, or Christopher, Natalie?
I'm happy to start. In terms of the EU CRCF, I think there are different approaches jurisdictionally that should be respected in light of common but differentiated responsibilities, overarching principles of the convention. But I think certainly it is a start, and it's also very interesting how domestically in the EU you could have removals and a removals framework approved, and internationally they would not be supporting removals in Article 6.4. That's a bifurcation that's a little head-scratchy, a little hard to understand, and I'm sure there are no geopolitics involved in that at all. So from that perspective, I'm interested to hear what others say. Can I just briefly touch upon the NCQG? I have to do that very deliberately in my mind. And Article 6, critically related. And I think the negotiators and countries are going to have to feel the pain of realizing that the private sector is not a consensual grant agency. Unless you have that certainty associated with Article 6, you will never hit related NCQG finance goals.
Olga, on CRCF?
No, I was asked to add pulling and viewing here, but I'm sorry, I cannot. I actually wanted to add one more on NCQG because I've heard this, this idea being promoted, especially for the NGOs, they're having somehow difficulty with the idea of carbon market and private, and I think for many people who have never tried to raise money for actual project implementation, it's hard to understand that you raise money by promising returns, and if you just go around asking for programmatic donations, you're actually not getting much. So it's a way of scaling finance, and yes, that's the reality of the capitalist world, that it would have to be private sector, and private sector is really, really powerful. And the defining characteristics of the carbon markets is that it's result-based. You actually have verifiable results for real, measurable, verified reductions, contributions to NDC, whatever you call them, which you do not have in other types of climate finance. And as to CRCF, well, in my personal view, again, as an individual, the failure of 6.4 was due to the conflict between CRCF and 6.4 removal guidance. We were aware of that conflict inside the ESB. I don't necessarily think that all 190 plus parties of the Paris Agreement take liking to CRCF. I think that should be applicable to their own jurisdictions. There are things that are useful and interesting, and things that are maybe not so relevant to the developing world and to how international offset markets should be operating.
Okay, we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So there was one at the back and one here on this side.
Thanks very much to the panel for a really interesting discussion. I'm Lewis Roger. I used to represent the United Kingdom in this domain. What are the sort of slightly underexplored tensions in the negotiations? I feel this might arise again in Baku, is the matter of revocation. For those not familiar, this is the idea that having an authorized activity and an ITMO transferred at the host country's discretion, that authorization status can be revoked at any one time. This strikes me as potentially a very significant problem in the future. And I was surprised actually at just how few parties were rallying against this in Dubai. So my question to the panel is do you share my concern that this could be a potentially very significant issue? Perhaps it might be interesting to hear Chris, from the investment side. Lisa, perhaps you might opine on the legals of this. And Olga, for Auld Lang Syne, maybe you might give us your insight into how it might play out in the negotiations and a potential way forward.
Thanks. Christopher.
Yeah, happy to start. Absolutely. I mean, for us, it's a critical question. And I think that I have heard more about insurance products in the last little while than I ever experienced in the voluntary carbon markets before. So I think this will be a critical piece. When we start talking about revocations and risk, look to your nearest insurance provider for some new products coming at you, I would say.
Well, from my perspective and the role, as I said before, it's a party-driven process. A lot of interest in the middle of whatever decision it's being taken. But at the same time, each country needs to bring back home the decision and then develop their scheme. And that will affect everything they do. And that goes the other way around as well. When the country is seated on the table, of course, it brings interest. And that's why I always tell people, okay, you need to get involved in your process and you need to demand what you want to see in the decision, because at the end, it's a technical person that has a mandate from a president for foreign affairs, from the Ministry of Environment, or whoever is the national focal point to the UN, and then bring in the topics to the table. From my perspective, right now, private sector needs to demand their representatives of what they need and what they want. A country that it's very good on that, it's yours. And especially after leaving the European Union, for the deployment of their foreign policy around the world after leaving the EU. So that's a very good example. Also, I think we need to put this in our NDCs if we want to see that in Article 6 at some point or at some level, because Article 6 is based on what you have in your NDC, either investment or your the UN climate change chief now call it the new climate plans, or NDCs 3.0. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, we are facing sargassum right now, which is a seaweed that is affecting our tourism. And that's, of course, because of climate change and a lot of things. I can keep talking about sargassum, but the problem is that we don't have sargassum in our NDC. So in order to develop a project that has everything around fighting sargassum and getting benefits from the carbon that we are removing from those gases, we need to put it in our NDC as either mitigation or adaptation. So I think the specific topic needs to be brought to the table through the new climate action plans that the country has to present in the first week of January 2025. So get involved in that, everybody.
Olga, Lisa, on revocation, but please briefly, so we have time for a final question.
3 elements of revocation. Revocation of the cooperative approach itself, revocation of the authorization, of the letter of authorization, and revocation of the issue. And revocation cannot be printing a dollar bill and ripping it up. So very clear. Great bridging wording put forward by UK, Canada, and New Zealand. I would encourage all to look at that. What has to happen is there must be a respect of sovereign rights to withdraw from a cooperative approach. There must be the ability to address fraud, to address criminal activity, money laundering, anything of that nature. There cannot be, and this is for the lawyers in the room, where are you, Lev? There cannot be, in relation to an LOA, retrospective and retroactive revocation of an authorization or an ITMO once issued. Absent fraud, absent criminal activity, you cannot print that dollar bill and rip it up. Going forward, of course. Going backward, no.
Olga?
Fully with Lisa, I mean, you can't really eat the cake and then ask to have it back, right? I'm fully with Louis, very surprised that so few people understand how much it's going to affect every contract potentially out there. I mean, it's the most basic fundamental transaction principle, right? And I think if you're working on projects, more of you should be getting in touch with your negotiators and representatives to talk with them and explain that your finance depends on the most basic common sense principle in commerce.
Okay, one question here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Zorzanelli, and I'm with the NBS Brazil Alliance. Our members represent more than 70% of all carbon credits of nature-based solutions in Brazil. And my question is, one of the criticisms of, the international dialogue is that we take years, right, around the discussion table to really, move slowly. And don't get me wrong, I've worked in the UN, so I know how complex it is, these conversations. But my question is, and it might be a little bit from my naive point of view, but I still want to bring the perspective, is that we're having the COP in Brazil next year, and do you believe that maybe because we're bringing the conversation really close to the Amazon forest, right to the middle of the Amazon forest, that it might bring some perspective of the urgency that is really, taking place, because even though these conversations take a long time, we do know that the clock is ticking. And every day, of course, the Amazon is being dismantled. So I wonder if you do believe in your hearts that you might help somehow to, see the importance of reductions, so then, the Amazon is not being dismantled, and also the importance of restoration of degraded land to right now, you know what I mean? So, thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to answer this? Natalie?
The truth? No. Sorry. Countries are not like that. We just had a COP in Dubai. And we had one before in Egypt. And we are going to Azerbaijan. And no, I don't think that's not going to bring much to what we need to achieve. What it's going to bring, what we need to achieve, is demanding your representatives in this club of government that you need decision and operationalization of whatever the UNFCCC needs to decide. And until people come together and demand their representatives, then you're gonna have negotiators at the table with the position that represents the best for the world and the communities specifically. But unfortunately, that doesn't work in the UN, being in the middle of the Amazon, unfortunately.
Lisa?
Unfortunately, I would agree with Natalie in terms of the rhetoric and the context doesn't really shape the outcome. However, the presidency does. And the Brazil presidency of the COP is wise. And the whole concept of shuttle diplomacy, prepping every country, putting hardcore pressure on them by the presidency, will, in fact, have a material difference. And I fully anticipate that the COP presidency in Brazil as the COP president, will have a material impact on Article 6. They will be laser focused on getting an outcome on Article 6.
Thank you. Time to wrap up. I'm sorry for those who wanted to ask a question and they didn't get the opportunity. I'm sure the conversation can continue in the lobby. So to end this panel, I'd like to ask the panelists for a quick message for the audience meeting here at NCS, primarily European private sector audience. Very briefly, 1 minute each, what message you'd like to give. And perhaps let's go in reverse order, starting from Christopher, then Natalie, Olga, and Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can say this. I mean, in response to this question as well you've just asked, which is so critical. I mean, I think what I'd sum up is the full passage of Article 6, when we have 6.4, when we're rolling along with 6.2 even more. As a market participant, I can say that we're ready to respond. I think you are probably as well. I mean, we are itching to get on these things, but we're currently pushing in an uncertain policy environment. Because I work for a cook stove company, though, I would put it this way. I mean, I think that we could say that, you know, I'm very fortunate to be up on the stage, but we've also got Cocoa, we've got Del Agua, BioLite, CO2 Balance, maybe other cook stove developers here. And in total, those of us all working in the African continent have probably put out about 5 million high-efficiency stoves across those countries. However, there are 200 million households on that continent who still need and deserve a clean cooking device. So we need this to go through, we need it to happen, you know, obviously as quickly as possible. It's estimated the world requires about 150 billion in funding to achieve universal access to clean cooking. So at the moment, that investment sits in the hundreds of millions. So this will be an important catalyst to exercise that capital.
My message is that Europe is developed. Europe, it's one that most of developing countries look at as an example. I recently moved to Madrid, and I'm like in happy land when I can separate my waste, when I'm taxed for not, you know, doing things that are green, or that I can walk to my office, or doing everything in a 30 minutes radius. but we cannot forget the small developing countries. And we need Europe knowledge and leadership to help us thrive. You need to demand the European Commission and the European Union to be cooperative in our negotiations. When the negotiator take the flag, it's, I think, whoever that represents a country needs to put themselves in the perspective of what the other country is demanding. And I've been educated in Europe. I think Europe, it's the lead region in terms of ETS, market, and everything around that. And it can keep thriving if cooperation with the countries that need the most gets done in timely manner.
Thanks. Olga?
Well, since majority of you, I guess, are European companies, but you came here to listen about Article 6, so my assumption is you're working internationally, and you're working with host country governments. My message would be to reach out to them and make sure that whatever decisions are taking, or that they make sure that whatever decisions are taking by the CMA are actually benefiting the developing world, because, you know, hopefully EU should be able to take care of itself, but it's the developing world that needs help. And if developing world doesn't speak up for itself, then there wouldn't be a case for that help to be provided.
And finally, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thanks so much for informing the dialogue and me. Democracy is messy. Consensus building is tough. And in the current geopolitical context, we have a bit of a bumpy road ahead. However, bilateral transactions and small plurilateral transactions are not as tough. So expect more of those in the short term.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Natalie and Christopher. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoyed too. And please join me in thanking our panelists.